The stories presented in this video are real, but we have changed the characters' names and altered images to protect their identities. The creator of this video is not an investigative officer. These narratives have been sourced from various internet platforms. Our intent is not to accuse or target anyone in particular. Thank you for understanding.
The True Crime Hub welcomes you. We'll be exploring a terrifying case today that takes place in the peaceful Crestwood suburb in the middle of February 2022. A apparently ideal family, sinister secrets, and a convoluted murderous scheme are all part of our story. For the Owens family, living in the peaceful Crestwood suburb appeared ideal. While her husband, Tom Owens, put in long hours as an accountant at a nearby firm, Karen Owens, a loving mother of two, was the epitome of the housewife. Their marriage looked strong, almost enviable, to others. On the inside, though, Karen was leading a double life. Unbeknownst to Tom, Karen had been having a number of covert affairs because she needed the thrill that her steady, predictable marriage could not provide. These interactions became increasingly frequent and dangerous over time, with Karen seeing her lovers at private parties, in hotels, and sometimes in their own house when Tom was away on business. Despite being cautious and constantly hiding her tracks, she was unable to avoid the excitement that accompanied every new affair. On that chilly February evening, Tom got home earlier than he had anticipated. He was exhausted from the flu and just wanted to surprise Karen by coming back out of the blue and then crashing into bed. In order to avoid waking the children who could already be asleep, he unlocked the front door gently. He observed that the house was abnormally silent as he passed along the corridor. The only noise was a slight rustle emanating from their bedroom above. His heart started to race with every step he took up the stairs. He had no idea why he was feeling this way. Perhaps it was the weird feeling of discomfort that seemed to linger in the air, or maybe it was the eerie silence. Ascending the stairs, he saw that the bedroom door was ajar a little, and a faint light was illuminating the hallway. Tom barely opened the door enough to get a glimpse, and his blood ran cold at what he saw. Karen was enmeshed with another guy in their bed, the bed they had shared for years. Tom was immobile for a time. The floor felt like it had been torn out from under him as he stood in the doorway. As he tried to take in the scene in front of him, his mind went blank. The mother of his children, the woman he had loved, was betraying him in the most intimate manner imaginable. It was Karen who first saw him. She gasped and pushed the man away from her in a panic as her face turned pale. Tom was unable to hear her as she attempted to talk, her voice shaking with horror. Though they reverberated in his head, he failed to notice them. He had the impression that he was observing everything from outside of himself, as though this were all occurring to someone else. Tom turned around and left the room without saying anything. He continued despite Karen's calls for him to stop. He knew he had to leave the house, but he had no idea where he was heading. As he went down the stairs and out into the chilly night air, he felt numb. He continued to walk in an attempt to get away from the pictures that were etched in his head. Nevertheless, the scenario kept playing no matter how far he went. A haze of confusion and rage characterized the days that followed. Tom was unable to eat or sleep. The only thing on his mind was Karen's treachery. The need to comprehend what had transpired gripped him. When she wasn't looking, he started rummaging through her phone, looking through her emails and examining every aspect of her life that he could get his hands on. What he found was much worse than he had anticipated. For years, Karen had been living a second life. The affairs had been going on for longer than he wanted to acknowledge, and there were other men involved. Every bit of proof he discovered was like another stab wound to his heart. Every secret meeting, covert email, and text message revealed a part of him he was unaware of. He had been living a lie with the lady he believed to be his friend and with whom he had formed a life. Tom reached his breaking point when he learned of Karen's adultery. His passion for her turned into something sinister and all-consuming. She had deceived him with not one but multiple men, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. Inside of him, the betrayal festered and became an obsession that took up all of his thoughts. It was impossible to sleep. Food's flavor was completely gone. Retaliation was the only thing on his mind. He couldn't ignore it. These men had taken his life, and he could not allow them to get away with it. Tom's thoughts were becoming more and more nasty as he started to plot his next move. He desired to face Karen's boyfriends and hold them accountable for their part in ruining his marriage. He dreamed about it, how he would make them feel the same suffering he felt, how he would make them disclose every detail of the affair. On March 3rd, 2022, Tom made the decision to take action. He had discovered that Derek, a local gym instructor, was one of Karen's lovers. Tom had been following Derek's routine for days and knew exactly where he was. Tom parked his car close to Derek's apartment that night and waited for him to come home in the dark. The street was still, and Tom's mounting anger appeared to be concealed by the darkness. At last, Derek showed up, and Tom's heart started pounding. Unaware of the impending storm, Derek was just an ordinary guy. Tom emerged from the shadows as Derek got closer to his building's entrance. Derek was shocked to see Tom when he looked up, but Tom confronted him before he could respond. Tom let out the rage that had been building within of him, and he insisted Derek tell him all about his liaison with Karen. Derek was taken by surprise, perplexed, and defensive. Tom wasn't paying attention, though. The altercation swiftly got out of hand, and Tom lost his temper when Derek attempted to leave. He instinctively reached for a gym towel Derek had draped over his shoulder. Tom quickly wrapped the towel around Derek's neck and started tugging. He tightened the towel, disregarding Derek's frantic attempts to defend himself, and the anger that had been building within of him now exploded. With all the sorrow and rage he had been suppressing, Tom's hold tightened and tightened. Derek was having trouble, but he continued. He was unable to stop. Everything he had been experiencing seemed to need to be let out right now. Tom saw Derek's body go limp in his grasp as his struggles waned. It was finally over. Tom was standing there, panting, staring down at Derek's corpse. He started to realize the truth of what he had just done. The anger that had motivated him had vanished, leaving behind a sense of emptiness and coldness. With his thoughts racing over what he had just done, Tom dropped the towel and retreated. He could never turn back from the line he had passed. Tom didn't get the relief he had hoped for after killing Derek. Rather, it increased his rage and, for the first time in months, gave him a sense of strength. One murder, he concluded, was insufficient. He had to get rid of all Karen's lovers. Tom carefully pursued 2 more individuals over the course of the following week, both of whom had had contact with Karen. Every murder was more vicious than the one before it. On March 6, 2022, Derek's body was discovered by a neighbor as Tom's anger increased and his sanity deteriorated. When Derek failed to show up for his regular morning run, the neighbor realized something was amiss. He knocked on Derek's door in concern, but no one answered. He made the decision to inspect the apartment. He discovered Derek's lifeless body inside after discovering the door was unlocked. The police showed up in a flash. They looked about, but they couldn't find many hints. There were no indications of a conflict, and Derek's apartment was tidy. The towel Tom had used was the only piece of evidence they could find, but it was fingerprint-free. The detectives were perplexed by the absence of proof. They were unable to identify a culprit or motive. On March 8, 2022, another man's body was discovered 2 days later. A local businessman was murdered in a motel room this time. When he failed to check out on time, the motel workers discovered him. There were obvious indications of a violent struggle when his body was discovered on the bed. The brutality of the murder was evident from the cuts and bruises. Once more, the cops were called. There was something odd about this crime scene. Although there were indications of a battle, there was still no concrete proof that identified the murderer. A few hairs and fibers were discovered by the police, but not enough to identify anyone. The investigation was complicated by the absence of security footage and witnesses. The police started to suspect a connection between the killings. The two victims had been killed within a few days of one another and were both guys. The investigators began searching for connections between the two men. They investigated their pasts in an effort to find any links. They discovered a common link when they looked into it. Karen Owens had been associated with both guys. The businessman had been seeing Karen for almost a year, and Derek had been her lover for a few months. The detectives began to examine Karen and her husband, Tom, more closely as a result of this relationship. Karen was chosen to be interviewed by the detectives. She seems astonished and distressed by the killing. She asserted that she had no idea why her partners were being singled out. She informed the police that she was attempting to mend her marriage and had put an end to her affairs. There was no evidence to refute her story, therefore it appeared plausible. After that, the investigators focused on Tom. He was also interviewed, but he also didn't appear to know about the killings. Tom looked glum and aloof, still in shock after learning of Karen's adultery. There was no concrete evidence connecting him to the killings, and his alibis for the nights of the killings seemed plausible. The investigation reached a dead end without any credible leads. Despite their suspicions, the detectives lacked hard evidence. They kept an eye on Tom and Karen in the hopes that the case would slow down, but it didn't. It was difficult to proceed because there were no witnesses or proof. The investigators were stuck for the time being, but they realized they needed more to solve the case. Tom was barely able to maintain his sanity by the middle of March. He was now being consumed from the inside out by the anger and shame that had motivated him for weeks. The darkness within him seemed to only deepen after he had already claimed lives. However, one more man remained. One more individual who had shared in Karen's covert existence. But this dude was different. He wasn't a passing fancy. He had been with Karen for more than a year and was a wealthy real estate agent. To Tom, he was the source of all his suffering. One evening, Tom made the decision to complete the task he had begun. His thoughts focused on what he was about to do. He followed the man around the city. The man drove to a remote location on the outskirts of town, where he frequently went to decompress, utterly oblivious to the danger he was in. Tom stood back and waited for the appropriate opportunity. His hands trembled and his heart thumped in his chest, but he was unwavering. There was no going back now that he had come this far. Tom crept in, his steps heavy with the weight of what he was about to do, as the man got out of his car. Tom could hear his own breath, loud and strained as the darkness appeared to press in around them. His mind a jumble of fear, despair, and rage. He walked toward the man. However, something within of him cracked, just as he was ready to strike. All of the suffering and rage that had been fueling him abruptly subsided, leaving him with nothing but a crippling sense of shame and dread at who he had become. Rather than strike the man, Tom collapsed to his knees, trembling violently. He started talking, his words spilling forth in a desperate, hurried confession. He filled the man in on all of Karen's affairs, his murder of Derek, and his complete loss of self-control. The man listened in astonishment, first bewildered, then afraid. The horror in his eyes was obvious, even though he had no idea who Tom was or why he was telling him these things. The man recognized his opportunity to get away as Tom kept talking incoherently. His heart thumping, he slowly retreated before turning and running back to his car. His hands shaking, He dialed the cops and drove off. Tom was still sitting in the mud, covered in blood, and babbling to himself when the cops arrived on the scene. He remained silent as they escorted him to the police car and didn't resist when they handcuffed him. Only a broken man who could hardly comprehend what he had done remained after the fire that had driven his acts had gone out. A startling turn of events occurred as Tom was being arrested. During their search of the Owens house, the police discovered evidence that suggested Karen had been aware of Tom's behavior from the beginning. It was discovered through text messages sent between Karen and one of her partners that she had been gradually fostering Tom's violent impulses and fueling his paranoia. It became evident that Karen had been manipulating things from the beginning, eliminating her boyfriends as she got sick of them by taking advantage of Tom's affection and jealousy. The chronology of Tom's spiral into insanity was swiftly put together by the investigators. On March 10, 2022, Karen was questioned by detectives. She initially pretended to be a distraught wife who was astonished by her husband's behavior. Karen was not the innocent victim she claimed to be, however, as the evidence grew, including text messages, phone logs, and even a diary in which she described her affairs and her developing contempt for Tom. Karen would allude to Tom's unreliability in text messages she sent with her husband, such as, "Tom, do you ever feel like people are laughing at you behind your back?" She would talk about being anxious and uneasy, gently encouraging Tom to consider violence. "While you were away yesterday night, I heard sounds," she would write, which frightened me so much and increased Tom's anger and paranoia. The last piece of the jigsaw was Karen's diary, which was discovered concealed in the attic. She had written extensively about her affairs, expressing how much she relished the excitement of living in secret, but the diary also showed how much she hated Tom. She wrote, "Tom is so boring. I wish he would simply vanish." But the most terrifying entries revealed her scheme to control Tom. "I can get him to snap if I push him hard enough. He is going to solve my problems." Tom was shocked when he was taken into custody. He was shocked by what he had done and shocked that Karen had discovered. The knowledge that she had exploited his affection to transform him into a monster was intolerable, since he had genuinely loved her. In an attempt to find some calm, he told the cops everything. Tom was charged with 3 charges of murder on March 15, 2022. His defense lawyer contended that Karen's deception and betrayal had driven Tom insane. The diary, the phone logs, and the text messages were shown to the court. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Karen, the prosecution, led by a shrewd and resolute DA, presented a portrait of a man who had let his envy drive him to commit a string of vicious murders. Beginning in early January 2023, the trial was held. The courtroom was packed every day. The drama was witnessed by people from Crestwood and beyond. The trial was widely covered by the media, which heightened the tense atmosphere. The prosecution got off to a terrific start. One of the most important pieces of evidence they offered was Karen's diary. Her affairs, manipulation, and deepening animosity toward Tom were all documented in the diary. Forensic evidence was also used by the prosecution. They used DNA, fingerprints, and other evidence to connect Tom to every crime scene. They demonstrated Tom's meticulous planning and execution of each crime. Karen's involvement, however, was the most startling aspect. Text communications between Karen and her lovers were shown by the prosecution. It became clear from these texts that Karen had been coercing Tom into using violence. She had taken advantage of his jealousy and affection. According to the evidence, Karen was a cunning, cold-blooded woman who had taken advantage of Tom. When Tom took the stand, it was the most emotional moment. He gave a moving and tragic testimony. He talked about how much he loved Karen and how her betrayal had broken his heart. He explained how he was pushed to insanity when he learned of her adultery. He stated how deeply guilty he felt for the killings he had carried out. His heartbreaking tale enthralled the jurors who listened in silence. Everyone in the room was profoundly affected by Tom's emotions and obvious regret. Karen's defense also attempted to portray her as a victim. She had never specifically requested Tom to kill someone, they contended. They asserted that she was merely a woman looking for excitement who was stuck in a loveless marriage. However, there was too much evidence against her. There was a definite pattern of manipulation in the text messages and diary entries. Additionally, Karen's icy tone on the witness stand hurt her case. Her portrayal as heartless and cunning only served to bolster the prosecution's case. Tom was ultimately convicted guilty on all counts by the jury. Even if they thought he had been duped, he had nonetheless killed people. Tom was given the death penalty on April 25, 2023. As the verdict was read, there was silence in the courtroom. Tom stood there, crushed and resigned, while his family wailed. Karen was convicted of killing someone. She received a 20-year prison sentence. 3 individuals had been slain as a direct result of her acts, the judge said, even if she had not killed anyone herself. Karen remained icy and uncaring until the very end, displaying little emotion as she was brought away. Given what transpired, one can only speculate that Tom's wife's severe adultery may have contributed to the creation of the monster inside him. Given his competence and determination for a novice, some speculate that this may not be the first murder Tom has committed. However, we question whether Tom could have handled his wife in a more constructive manner. If his wife hadn't tricked him, could he have also escaped punishment for perhaps just one murder? One police officer even told us that it would have been preferable if he had just killed his wife rather than killing the men who had a simple affair with her. Now that Tom is gone, he only received a death sentence due to a woman, not a life sentence. To ensure you don't miss any of our true crime stories, kindly subscribe to the channel.